Here in 19.3, we're going to continue our examination of international trade issues. Now, in particular, you remember we've been talking about issues of why countries oftentimes want to restrict trade, even though economists, generally speaking, when you examine the benefits of trade, are in favor of free international trade. Well, let's go through some of the arguments and see both their strengths and weaknesses. So let's take a look at saving jobs. One of the arguments for having trade restrictions is if you can choke off the imports, and I'll give an example. Let's assume we put a major restriction on the importation of Toyotas and Hondas and Nissans into the US. One of the purposes of doing so would be to make more jobs available for Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors workers. So saving jobs will be the issue we deal with on this particular slide. The only problem is it's true that you could save jobs in those particular industries, but remember the way we're accomplishing this is we're choking off the competitive car companies of Toyota, Honda, and Nissan, which means the American car companies will raise their prices and therefore fewer cars will be built and sold to Americans. So one of the major problems with this argument is it only saves jobs in those import competing industries, but we oftentimes forget that we actually generate more jobs from having international trade. It turns out, for instance, that many companies buy parts that they need in order to produce their particular product. So let's assume that you are a Ford Motor Company and you import your water pumps made in Mexico into the United States in order to make the Ford car competitive. If we also choke off the parts companies from importing stuff, then we drive up the cost of domestic production. And we drive it up so much that it actually damages the very industry we're trying to help. So, as our final bullet point on this slide points out, more jobs are created than lost due to international trade. The problem, of course, is those jobs are nowhere near as easily visible. Seeing an auto worker laid off because of import competition from Toyota is pretty obvious, whereas all the jobs created from the fact that we're able to buy our parts cheaper from Mexico or China or wherever, and therefore the company that's importing those parts now is able to be more competitive in the export market, that is much, much less visible. However, as an economist, and you all, now that you're studying these things, you can see the logic of the argument and recognize that choking off trade actually damages jobs on net. It doesn't actually increase the number of jobs. Let's take a look at another pressure for imposing trade restrictions. Here, the ones we're going to look at are the national security argument and the dumping argument. Let's first of all start with national security. This one is actually a pretty reasonable and legitimate argument. The problem is it is often illegitimately applied, even though in theory it makes sense. The national security argument says we don't want foreigners who could potentially be enemies of the United States controlling something that's important to national security. For instance, let's assume that the F-16 airplanes that we need to defend the skies of the United States require a special computer chip to make the planes more effective. Now, who do we want making those computer chips? Do we want the Chinese or the Russians to be making those chips? Well, you could easily see there could be a problem. How do you know, first of all, if a war breaks out, how do you know you'll be able to get a hold of the chips that you need to keep the planes flying? And then number two, how do you know that the foreign governments haven't put a back door in the chip or whatever so they can actually turn your plane off in the middle of a war? Well, those are kinds of things that there's no way the Defense Department would permit a critical chip that's installed in an F-16 airplane to be made by a foreign power. So that would be an example of a legitimate use of national security as an argument. However, that same argument of national security has been misused by many manufacturers, and this is what we have on the screen. It turns out that at one time, the U.S. shoe industry was in decline. The United States, if you went back to the 1940s, was a major shoe producer, but today it is not. And the reason, of course, is that shoes are primarily made with relatively low-skilled labor, and American labor is way too expensive to spend on shoe manufacturing, so we import most of our shoes. We get them from China and Brazil and Vietnam and Malaysia and all kinds of countries that have a surplus of labor, which is relatively cheap, and they make our shoes for us. Now, the U.S. military needs shoes as well, don't they? Not only do they need fancy chips to fly F-16 airplanes, but Marines and Army soldiers need to wear boots when they go into combat. Can we make the argument that the United States needs to ban or restrict the importation of shoes in order to make sure that the U.S. shoe industry can survive in order to maintain national security? Well, that argument was actually made, and the U.S. government has been actively subsidizing shoe manufacturers for the U.S. military. Most economists are very leery of this argument. We see this more as a form of special pleading in order to take care of a special interest group, because the U.S. military, to get around this problem, could just simply stock up on boots purchased much more inexpensively from Brazil. Boots are not the critical issue that determines whether we win the war or lose the war. And like I said, we could simply stock up on them and buy them cheaply from Brazil rather than make them expensively in the United States. So here's what I meant when I said the national security argument is legitimate. It's legitimate in certain circumstances, but the argument is oftentimes captured by special interest groups to try to apply it to themselves when in fact they are not really critical to national security. And all they're trying to do is protect themselves from competition. But remember, competition is what keeps the price low for most people. And therefore, the cost of the restrictions prices are generally higher in the United States. So we want to avoid that. So we need to make sure the national security argument is not misused. The next argument on our slide is something called dumping. And that should probably be put in quote marks. I mean, it's a slang term that became technical over time. And what this refers to is a foreign country selling goods to the United States. So that would be our imports, the foreign country's exports to the U.S. are being sold at prices below what they charge in their home market. And this means, of course, that we in the United States are getting the product cheap. But of course, this hurts the import competing firm in the United States. And they oftentimes complain to Congress saying it's not fair for us to compete against these quote-unquote dumped goods in our market. Now, whether it's fair or not, we have a really interesting issue. If there are lots of foreign companies like shoe manufacturers in multiple different countries all selling their shoes in the United States cheaply, what's the proper strategy? Ban them and let Americans pay more for shoes produced by American domestic manufacturers? Or is the best strategy simply to accept all of these inexpensive shoes, let the Americans get out of the shoe business, and spend way more time making Apple computers or something else that's of far higher value? Most economists would argue that the second strategy is better. Accept the dumped product, because that means you're buying it at below cost, I mean super cheap, which is definitely a benefit to us, the importer, and simply take advantage of the exporting firms when they're doing all this dumping, and then use our time and our resources and our people to produce higher valued products. That would be the alternative to the trade restrictions. Here's another argument that's often used to justify trade restrictions. It's called the infant industry argument. So, luckily, this should make pretty much common sense where we get the name. An infant industry is a brand new industry that's not fully established yet. Just like an infant child is a human being, but they're not an adult and they can't take care of themselves. So the argument is, just like in a family where you have a mother and a father who put a tremendous effort into taking care of their infant, the argument is transferred to the economic realm where the government becomes the quote-unquote parent, and they take care of the infant industry until it quote-unquote grows up and can take care of itself. And how do you quote-unquote take care of the infant industry? Well, you put in whatever trade restriction, which we'll talk about in a few slides and remind ourselves of what the trade restrictions are, but you try to restrict the foreign competition in order to give room for the infant industry to grow. Again, the problem is, while on the surface this can actually sound and be a good policy when used judiciously, it's very, very easily corrupted by special interest groups who claim they deserve to be treated as a special infant industry, even when the trade restrictions raise the cost to all other Americans. So, and then one last problem. The other problem of infant industry is not only the high cost that they generate, but something called becoming a hothouse industry. Just like the infant industry is a metaphor taken from children compared to adults, the hothouse industry, you all might recognize a hothouse is what, like those glassed-in greenhouses where you raise orchids and other kinds of like tropical plants in a northern climate because you're protecting the plant. So here the problem, of course, as you probably know, with a hothouse, whatever is living in the hothouse, if it's a tropical plant in a northern environment, could never survive without the protection of the hothouse. And that's the analogy we're using here. Infant industries, the theory of an infant industry is you protect it until it quote unquote grows up and then becomes competitive, and then you remove the restriction and expect them to compete like everybody else. Because as we've already discussed, competition is a very good thing. All that supply and demand stuff we did at the beginning of the semester all talks about why firms need to compete with each other in order to get the market price low for consumers. So you don't want to protect the infant industry forever. You simply want to protect it until it becomes competitive. But what if instead you create a hothouse industry, meaning your protection, just like the greenhouse, is something that the firm needs permanently? Because it's never faced real competition before, right? And so oftentimes what happens is the firms never truly become competitive. Instead, they constantly need the protection from the government, which means that the products that they're producing are now much higher priced than they would be if we simply imported them. And we keep having to subsidize them essentially indefinitely, either through trade restrictions or direct taxpayer subsidies. Either one of those, of course, is creating an industry that's not competitive and is sucking up resources rather than producing resources. So this is a very serious danger of the infant industry argument, and many, many industries have ended up absorbing huge dollars worth of subsidies and have never become competitive. Last but not least on this particular issue, another thing that groups who ask for special favors of protection from imports oftentimes use the argument that we don't want protection for ourselves. What we want the government to do is use the threat of import restrictions in order to quote unquote renegotiate the trade agreements so that the United States gains more in the terms of trade. Remember that term we used in previous set of slides. The terms of trade refer to the price at which the trades take place. We all know that there's lots of room within the benefit to people how much they're willing to pay in order to get a hold of a good. If you can shift the terms of trade in the favor of your own country by threatening to impose huge tariffs on the foreign product, you might be able to drive the price down. That's the argument being made here in the improving terms for trade. The big problem, of course, is these things oftentimes backfire and you end up creating something called a retaliatory tariff, which we'll go into more detail on another slide, but I'll just mention it real quickly here. A retaliatory tariff means, let's assume that we threaten the Chinese and say, unless you sell the solar panels to the US at a lower price than you're currently doing it, we're going to choke off your exports to the United States with a huge trade restriction. Well, how might the Chinese react? They could react in the opposite direction and say, oh yeah, well if you do that to our solar panels, we're going to put a huge trade restriction on your Apple computers. You can't sell them in China without a huge restriction. So what you end up doing is both countries end up shooting themselves in the foot with these restrictions. These are very dangerous things to do because whenever you threaten another country with a trade restriction, they can oftentimes counter-threaten you by doing the same thing. So you end up starting what's called a trade war, and both countries impose lots of tariffs or taxes on imported goods, and that just simply drives up the cost for both countries. Now, what are the different kinds of barriers to trade that we could do? We keep mentioning tariffs. That's just one mechanism. Let's go through several mechanisms that a country can use to keep foreign goods out of its market. The most dramatic one is the embargo. The embargo is a prohibition on imported goods. You all might recognize that word embargo from several different examples. We had a very famous embargo imposed by the Saudis back in the early 1970s when the United States backed the Israelis during one of the Israeli-Palestinian wars. In particular, this was the Yom Kippur War of 1974. And the U.S. backed Israel, and of course the Saudis backed their fellow co-religionists, the Palestinians, and what they did was they cut off oil exports to the United States. And that would be an example of an embargo. They refused to do business. They prohibited the export of oil to the U.S. So the embargo can be either an export prohibition or an import prohibition. So for instance, in the United States, we could embargo Japanese cars, which would mean that Toyota, Honda, Nissan are no longer allowed to physically export goods to the United States. It literally goes to zero the number of cars. That would be an embargo. A tariff is similar to, but not as draconian as an embargo. With a tariff, what you do is you put a tax on the imported good. So let's again continue with our example of putting a tariff on Japanese cars. So let's assume right now there is no tariff on Japanese cars. So Japanese cars compete directly. Let's say a Toyota competes directly with a Ford or a General Motors or a Chrysler product. Now, what if the government put a 30% tax on Toyotas? So a $20,000 Toyota would now have a roughly $7,000 tax put on it. So now it would become a $27,000 Toyota. So picture in your mind a particular market, let's say where the Corollas compete. So Toyota Corollas, sell for around $20,000. Now they sell for $27,000. So the Ford Escort, or let's see, I can't think of the name of the small Ford car. It's just escaping my mind at the moment. But Chevy also has a very small car. Those cars would now be competing at the $20,000 price, but the Toyota Corolla would be at the $27,000 price. And while a few people will go ahead and pay the extra money to get the Toyota, I think you all recognize Toyota sales of Corollas would fall dramatically. And that would be the purpose of the tariff. By using a tax on the imported good, what the domestic firm wants is for American buyers to no longer buy the Toyota car, but to buy the domestic car. But you notice, the buyer has to pay more for the cars. There's no way to expect that General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler are going to continue selling cars at $20,000 when their main competitor has been driven up to $27,000. Most likely what they'll do is raise their price to $25,000, still be below the Toyota price, but what will happen to the prices consumers pay? Every consumer pays more for cars than they used to pay. So that's the big danger of these barriers to trade. While they benefit the workers and the stockholders of Ford and Chrysler and General Motors, they do it at the expense of literally every American who ever bought a car. Very dangerous things to be doing. And our last example of a barrier to trade, this is the third one. So we did embargoes, we did tariffs, now we have a quota. So with a quota is basically a loose embargo. So instead of having an absolute ban, which is what an embargo does, a quota sets a numerical limit on the amount of cars that can, or whatever good that can be imported. So again, let's go back to our car example. Let's assume that Toyota exports 1 million cars a year to the United States. Now, the United States has a roughly 15 million car a year market. It's a pretty large market. And let's assume Toyota has 1 million cars a year that they're selling into the United States that are being produced in Japan. So with a quota, what the government does is they set a numerical limit. For instance, let's set the limit at 700,000 cars. So Japan is permitted to sell 700,000 cars. No matter what price they charge, they can only sell 700,000. Now, is that going to cause a shortage or a surplus of Corollas and other Toyota products in the US? Well, clearly a shortage, right? And as you all know, whenever there's a shortage, what happens to the price? The price goes up. And this permits General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler to also raise their prices, but still come in less than the Toyota. And so Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler take away business from Toyota, which was the whole point of the quota to begin with, right? We're trying to put trade restrictions on foreigners to benefit Americans. But remember which Americans are benefiting. It's the stockholders at Ford, the workers at Ford, but what about the Americans who buy cars? They're being hurt. And there's way more people who buy cars that are being hurt than there are people in Detroit that are being helped. And that's always the danger to these things. Instead of the decision of purchasing and where things are manufactured being made by competitive business people based on the true costs of production, the decision is now being made for political reasons, and it's distorting the market. So when people buy either an American car or a Toyota car, it's no longer being based on the merits, but it's being based on the accidents of whatever the quota number was, whatever the embargo was, whatever the tariff was, now distorts people's decisions. So let's sum up this whole issue of the tariffs and tariff barriers, and both their good and their bad. So remember, every country that tries to impose a tariff or other non-tariff barrier against imports is trying to protect a particular industry and protect the workers and the owners in that industry. But remember, the cost of doing so is it raises prices and reduces total output for the entire country. So let's go through a quick list of on our slide here to remind ourselves of what's being done. So total international trade decreases. The standard of living in both countries, both the country doing the trade barrier and not permitting the imports, and the country doing the exports are both damaged. The importing country is damaged by paying higher prices for the goods and services that it would normally buy from imports, and of course the exporting country loses the export business. So there's total output, less total output in the world is produced. So free trade does the exact opposite. Since it reduces the prices and it increases production, it turns out both countries benefit. So the final takeaway is, even though specific jobs in particular importing industries can be protected, the cost of the protection is it damages the entire economic system. So economists are generally pro-free trade and are usually looking askance at protection as merely the protection of a special interest group, but at the cost of damaging the rest of society.